He's That Eric Alper.
And this is his show.
It's That Eric Alper Show on Canada Talk.
SiriusXM 167.
Welcome to the program. My name is Eric Alper. So great to have you along. If I were to neatly wrap up this show at the beginning with a bow, it's probably... This show is going to be about voices. Later on in the program, we're going to be talking to Cadence, who are Toronto's and Canada's premier vocal group. They're a cappella, and they're going to be coming up in the next segment. And also, somebody that gets to use their voice a lot in doing what they do is George Stroumboulopoulos. He is the new voice behind the audiobook of the brand new Tragically Hip biography called The Never Ending Present, the story of Gord Downie and the Tragically Hip. He's going to be joining me at the end of the show. But first, what happens when you want to use your voice for maybe somebody that's no longer here? In June of this year, the University of Victoria Libraries launched the archives of Saul Holiff, the former manager of Johnny Cash, with the permanent collection Volatile Attractions. Saul Holiff, Johnny Cash, and managing a music legend. The archives of showbiz pioneer Saul Holiff are now available to researchers and the public alike, with a digital physical exhibit at the University of Victoria's Marion Centre for Learning found in the McPherson Library. The collection includes thousands of rare and exclusive items revealing more about the life of Johnny Cash, such as when the KKK threatened to kill him, first-hand accounts of his 1966 overdose right here in Toronto, and the origin and the cover-up of Folsom Prison Blues. After Saul's death in 2005, his son Jonathan discovered hundreds of letters and audio diaries, including recorded phone calls with Johnny. In 2013, Jonathan released the critically acclaimed documentary My Father and the Man in Black, using Saul's extensive archives. And last year, the book, The Man Who Carried Cash by Julie Chadwick, who was also a guest on the show, that book was released, which dives into the unlikely and rocky relationship between the American country superstar and his straight-laced Canadian manager. And right now, I'm so pleased to have on the phone Jonathan Holiff. Hey, man, how are you?
Hi, Eric. I'm fine, thank you.
Good. So in the last little bit, I'm going to say in the last number of years, the remarkable story of your father is finally being recognized with books and events, and most recently the Jack Richardson Lifetime Achievement Award at the 2018 London Music Awards. As a son, this has to make you feel really good.
Oh, it really does. Thank you. We're very pleased.
Where do you begin in the story of the University of Victoria now having access to these archives? Did you start thinking about this and approaching universities? Because you're based in Victoria now, right?
That's true. And obviously, this collection would have seemed destined for the United States, probably the Johnny Cash Museum in Nashville. However, as it turns out, Cash's longtime manager was a proud Canadian, and he also was someone who had to drop out of school in the middle of the Depression in the 1930s to help feed his family. And he finally went back to school as a mature student at the University of Victoria, where he graduated with a BA in history. So I think my father would be especially proud to know that his collection is at that school.
I would imagine that there's collectors around the world that are kicking themselves and would like to kick you and say, how come you didn't stick this on eBay? How come you didn't give it to the highest bidder? Because certainly I'm sure that had crossed a number of people's minds of just the sheer worth of something like this.
Yeah, I hear it a lot, and it is a sizable collection, but it really belongs in Canada. And indeed, a lot of the Johnny Cash story takes place in Canada. As your listeners may know, it was my father, Saul, who hired June and put her with Johnny. And indeed, it was in our hometown of London, Ontario, where Johnny proposed to June.
And your father, I mean, even before Johnny Cash, he was a pretty big promoter anyway. He was one of the first people to bring rock and roll to Canada, working with Bill Haley and Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly.
That's absolutely true. He was quite the promoter along many different businesses. In fact, he opened the first drive-in restaurant in southwestern Ontario with push-button ordering from your car. And his idea to build that business was to bring his acts, his performers, by the restaurant after they performed locally, And it was one night in 1958 that he met a young Johnny Cash at that restaurant.
So fast forward to after his passing away, where are all of these things housed? Like all the contracts and all the photos and the correspondence, where are they?
Well, they're all at the library at the University of Victoria. There's over 5,000 individual items. These were all found following my father's death by me in a storage locker my father had kept for years. I had no idea.
Did you know that he had a storage locker to begin with?
No, I didn't. I had been living in California for many years. I was estranged from my father. My father committed suicide in 2005. I came back to Canada to console my mother and help her out, and it was then that she informed me that the storage locker was there. And coincidentally, that same week, a little movie called Walk the Line opened in theaters. And I was reticent about going to the storage locker. I didn't know what I'd find there. I didn't know that there was Johnny Cash material there. I just didn't want to start unboxing the past, if you will. But after seeing that movie, and indeed there was an article in the Canadian papers that same week with a rather bold headline that read, Saul Holiff deserves role in Walk the Line. So I went straight from watching that movie to the storage locker, and that's when I opened it up.
So when you're living in California, I would imagine that you're pretty fully aware of your father's mark in rock and roll and in music. When did you first realize that your father had a different job than most people?
Well, that's a great question. I did and I didn't. People often ask me, did I meet Cash? Well, yes, I was 9 months old on my first Johnny Cash tour. But my father quit Cash rather famously at the time. In 1973, I was about 10 years old. And subsequently, as you know, Cash kind of went downhill. His career was pretty quiet for the next 20 years.
Yeah.
And for all I knew, my father was a pencil pusher in some office tower somewhere. So it wasn't really until I saw the movie, I read those articles in the Canadian papers, I opened up the storage locker, and I discovered that my father was every bit as important to Cash as Colonel Tom Parker was to Elvis or Brian Epstein was to the Beatles.
Yeah, absolutely. No question about that. When you get into that storage locker for the first time, are you thinking this has to be archived? Like, where do you go from there with organizing everything? Or do you? And do you start to put together maybe a team of people to kind of help you out with this?
Yes, exactly. There was obviously a huge amount of material there, but at the same time, it did require several years of research, which ultimately turned into a feature-length documentary I made in 2013 called My Father and the Man in Black. But among the most interesting and mind-blowing parts of this collection found in the storage locker were over 600 letters between Johnny and Saul and June, and most surprisingly of all, over 60 hours of audio diaries and secretly recorded phone calls with Cash.
So that must have blown your mind to not only know that your dad had such a big part in one of the most legendary performers that ever existed in North America. And without knowing about your relationship with your father, you said that you were estranged. Did it kind of make you feel like you know your dad a lot more, or did it kind of put yourselves in his shoes for maybe some of the fighting or some of the things that went on between you two specifically? Absolutely.
There were two aspects really for me, the personal and, of course, the showbiz story. But my family story is not unlike so many people who have had issues with one parent or the other. And so when I found the audio diaries in particular and heard my father, I was his age listening to recordings he had made decades before, and to hear his voice almost talking to me across the years was a very emotional and cathartic experience. And ultimately, I learned that my father was filled with self-doubt, and he had many problems, and he knew it. So the fact that he was self-aware was the biggest surprise. These were things he never admitted to or shared with his family. He always presented a very strong front. So it was a great find for me to discover that my father was all too human.
Yeah, I think that blows away any son when he finds out that maybe he could be beaten in baseball or in tennis, and they are made human, especially when you grow up in an entertainment environment where, you know, one of the parents might be away a lot or might have a lot of struggles. There's obviously, you know, the drugs or the alcohol or the abuse or the cheating that goes on in the entertainment world. Not that your father was involved in any of that, but you realize that these people have probably just as much, if not more, self-doubt and self-awareness of their problems than the people that they're managing in the first place.
Absolutely. These were the interesting years with Johnny Cash. From 1960, the hiring of June Carter, through the drugs and arrests throughout the 60s, culminating in Folsom Prison, San Quentin, and Johnny's hit television show on ABC. I suppose I grew up resenting Johnny for taking my father away.
Yeah.
He was always on the road. But listening to these audio diaries in particular, it became evident that my father was talking into a tape recorder as a means of kind of practicing some kind of therapy. This was back in the day, in the 60s, when it was taboo to see a therapist, let alone admit to seeing one. So it was absolutely fascinating for me to get to know my real father.
Yeah, and also taking care of somebody else's world. You know, that's the hardest thing, I think, for a manager. It's not so much of the business deals or being able to say yes at the right times or no at the right time, but many of them control their artist's career and their client's career 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, expected to be there on call. And meanwhile, their family is at home wondering, when does my husband get home?
Exactly. And it's funny you use the word control. A lot of people who have seen my documentary comment on what appears to them that my father managed me much like he managed Johnny Cash. He had me sign contracts as a child and had me meet certain hallmarks or expectations. And
did that bother you? Taking a look at that back now, do you just wish that, why couldn't you just be a father like most? Or do you see what you do now in your daily life, or how you think? Do you think that was a good thing?
Yeah, don't we all wish our parents were more like the Brady Bunch? I'm sure I felt that way at the time, and looking back, it is a kind of an unusual approach to parenting, no question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, sometimes it's the only way to know how to deal with anything.
True.
Yeah. What's the best thing, and maybe not the best thing to a Johnny Cash fan, but what was like the most interesting thing that you found, other than the audio tapes, that you got to hear your dad one more time?
Well, I'd like, if you don't mind, to address the Johnny Cash fan, because the audio diaries were what really impressed me as the son of my father. But from a Johnny Cash fan point of view, the material found in this locker, I guess, kind of breaks news. You mentioned in your intro about the Ku Klux Klan and Johnny having cribbed a song from the 1950s called Crescent City Blues by Gordon Jenkins for his big hit Folsom Prison Blues. But in addition to that, I would say that among the letters, for example, there's a 10-page handwritten rant that Johnny wrote to Saul on October 21st, 1967, informing my dad that June had just left him. He goes on for 9 more pages lamenting that fact and expressing his anger for everyone around him. And he really had hit rock bottom. But what's most noteworthy about that is it was considered to be the last letter Johnny had written before he hit rock bottom. And just less than 3 months later, he rose from the ashes like a phoenix, if you will, at Folsom Prison for that seminal record in 1968. So there's incredible material there. There's song lyrics and poems and, of course, these dynamite recorded phone calls, and all of which are not only available to the public in person, but you can access a lot of this material on the web at the University of Victoria Library.
Yeah, and that's at uvic.ca. Then you can just go from there. If you're a Johnny Cash fan, you probably I would say have a little bit of insight to not only his personal life and his love for June and his problems with drugs or alcohol and what really brought him back during those Rick Rubin sessions. What do you hope that people come away with about your father specifically, and not so much about Johnny Cash?
Well, the thing that impressed me most about what I learned about my father, and from many interviews I conducted with people who worked with them on the show, both on the touring show as well as the television show, was the fact that Saul, I'm told, was every bit as powerful as Johnny was. I was told that when my father walked into a room, people turned and stopped talking. He was every bit as important to their partnership as Johnny was. I'm not suggesting for a moment that Johnny Cash wouldn't have been successful without Saul Holiff, but it was the combination of the two men. My father was the one who told Johnny that he needed to play bigger venues and subsequently produce shows at Carnegie Hall and the Hollywood Bowl, and renegotiated his recording contracts and had him switch producers, which led to Folsom Prison. So I think, generally speaking, fans will better appreciate the fact that our favorite stars are not just immaculately conceived. There's a whole team of people behind them that help them get to where they are.
Absolutely. And you can go to the University of Victoria Libraries that launched the archives of Saul, the former manager of Johnny Cash. It's available in person and online as well. Hey, Jonathan, thank you so much. Thanks for finding it, first of all, and thanks for your continued efforts to get all of these items out there into the world. I appreciate it.